Chapter 2 The Spook in the Jar. Sam still had no idea where he was, but he felt like he was losing his mind. For a while, he wasn't able to figure out how the spider had disappeared. He had come to the conclusion that it was either an illusion or his imagination. Considering the magical nature of the place, he decided it had to be an illusion. He wondered whether the spider that had chased him and the one he had met in the new room were the same. He concluded that they were different spiders, however, because the first spider had actually touched him, and he had felt its breath on his back. So it seemed that some of the spiders in the maze were real, and others fake. But it wasn't only some of the spiders which were fake. Several times, Sam approached doors that had appeared in the walls, and when he had tried to walk through them, his face hit a wall. Now he made sure to feel first with his hands to avoid any possible bruises. Because he could not trust his eyes to tell him what was real or not, Sam felt particularly vulnerable. Thoughts such as, what if one of the real spiders is disguised as a wall, or what if I mistake a real spider for a fake one, kept popping into his mind, and he had to do his best to ignore them and push onward. However, although he knew his goal, leave this strange maze and get back home to Tolheath, he had no idea whether he was getting closer to escaping or not. Every passageway, every doorway, even the individual stones themselves looked the same. The same dim, bluey light lit all the featureless rooms and passages, and he could not tell the passing of time. He had no idea how long he had been there. It might have been a day, or just a few hours. All he knew was that resting was too dangerous, and although he felt tired, he certainly did not feel like sleeping. With giant spiders wandering the passages, he could not afford to let his guard down. This constant need to look out for danger was taking its toll on him, though. The whole thing was made infinitely worse by the size of the passages. Every hallway was uniform in shape and size. The ceilings remained 6 feet tall, and the width of the passages was always 5 feet. Every passageway looked exactly the same as the previous one. Sam felt heavy from the claustrophobia, and had to control his breathing carefully. The longer he spent searching the maze of passages, the more he trembled, shook, and felt like breaking down in tears. While stopping to cry had the potential to relieve some tension, Sam was intelligent for his age, and knew that if he did, he would be crippled by emotion, and unable to continue moving for a long time, leaving him an easy meal for roaming giant spiders. Sam had something to distract himself, though, from the claustrophobia and even the imminent danger he was in, and that was the maze itself. He knew there had to be some kind of pattern. Nobody made mazes without a way to get out, he reasoned. If he could figure out the pattern, he would be able to escape and go home to Tolheath. At first, he had no idea how to keep track of all the archways he had walked through, or all the passages he had come down, until he found a sharp stone lying on the floor. Sam's attention had been caught by it immediately, because it was the only piece of anything in the entire maze. All the passageways were clean of rubble and debris, and yet, by good fortune, he had found something on the floor that was not part of the maze, but separate, individual, and independent. Like him, it was a lonely and abandoned stranger in an eerily uniform construction. But it wasn't only because of the strange connection Sam had with the stone that he picked it up. It was also because of its usefulness as a marker. When Sam passed through an archway, he made sure to scratch a number on either side, and when he went down a new passage, he would mark an arrow on one of the stones pointing to an archway he had come through with the number scratched above. He had gone through 3 doors and marked them all, and although he still didn't know where the way out was, he knew where he was in the maze, and that made him feel better about his predicament. Marking the walls with the stone, he learnt new things about the maze. The first was that the archways would reappear at different times, allowing him to go back to old areas he had already come from. The second was that every single passageway either ended in a doorway, a room, or a dead end, and any dead end or room could have an archway magically appear in it. Despite wandering through different archways for what must have been hours, Sam did not come across any giant spiders again, real or fake. But the fear of meeting one was rooted in the back of his mind, and every new passageway, archway, and room was entered with tension. It was as he was going back from a room he had dubbed David — he had started naming the chambers so he wouldn't confuse them with the numbered doorways — that he saw the stones at the end of one of the passageways start to form an archway. He watched until the archway was complete and saw that it led to another chamber. Not just any chamber, however, but one with a pedestal inside it. Maybe there is something on it to help me get out of here, Sam thought, his whole being filled with hope. He ran to the archway, scratched a number 4 on one of the stones, and marched through it. After scratching another 4 on the other side, he turned to look at the pedestal in the middle of the new room. It was curious. The pedestal had nothing on it, but a black glass jar, and next to it, a messy pile of cloths lying on the floor. Sam looked around the room before inching closer to the centre of it. There were no other passages in this room. The archway behind him had to be the only entrance into the chamber, at least for now. The glass jar resembled a jam jar stuffed with sticky black jam, and Sam paid little attention to it. He was more interested in the pile of cloths on the floor. The maze wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either, and extra clothes could be useful. He was surprised to find that the pile of cloths actually was a pile of clothes. But... oh no, he groaned, picking up one of the articles of clothing. It was a dark purple dress, with a couple of yellow stars stitched on it. Not only was it for a girl, but it was also too small for him to wear. He looked on the ground. The only other 2 pieces of clothing were a small pair of bright pink mittens and a dark blue shoulder cape with a hood. None of these would fit him, except the cape, so he decided to put it on. But as he picked it up... hello! Sam leapt around and dropped the cape when he heard the voice. Hey, you're real! It was the voice of a girl. You have to be. You're touching my clothes. He looked around the room, but he couldn't see anyone, girl or otherwise. Where are you? He asked, confused. I'm in the jar. Sam turned to look at the jar on the pedestal. He noticed now that it wasn't actually coloured black, but contained what looked like swirling black smoke. Then, in the smoke of the jar, 2 white glowing orbs appeared, and looked up at him like a pair of eyes. He looked at them, the eyes in the jar completely emotionless. Hey, the jar said. Then it was as if Sam had been struck by lightning. He yelled, fell onto the floor, and scrambled backwards until he was touching the wall, his eyes fixated on the jar and its contents with a terrified curiosity. He knew what was in the jar. His mother had told him stories about these spirits. Spook, he stammered. What? Wait, no, I'm not a spook, the shadows in the jar said. Oh, yes you are, Sam said. You're the perfect example of one, dark and shadowy. Those 2 white orbs were unblinking, and seemed to be staring into Sam's soul, and the more he looked at them, the more frightened he became. I'm not a spook, the shadows replied, a tone of desperation in the voice. Just what a spook would say, Sam said. Please, listen, the voice pleaded. I've been trapped here for, I don't know how long. Please, I'm not a spook. I don't want to hurt you, and it is really cramped in here. Please, let me out. What, so you can haunt my dreams? Sam asked accusingly. His mother had told him about 2 twins, whose dreams had been haunted by a spook. They had such terrible nightmares that the 2 twins decided never to sleep again, and after 2 weeks of no sleep, they died from exhaustion. Sam knew he had to sleep at some point, and that would be difficult enough without a spook hovering over him. I can't haunt anyone's dreams, the shadows replied. I can only inhabit clothes. Please, set me free. No, said Sam. You're an evil spook, and you can stay in there. Sam turned, deciding he'd had enough of the room, and headed towards archway number 4. However, the archway was gone, and the only thing on that wall was the number he had scratched into the stonework. No, please don't leave, the voice cried. Sam could have sworn he heard fear and desperation in that voice, and it touched his heart a little, but he shook his head violently, and removed all thoughts of helping the spirit from his mind. It's acting, he thought. Don't be fooled. It is an evil thing, and is probably using a girl's voice to try and trick me into helping it. What would it take to persuade you I'm not a spook? The shadows in the jar asked suddenly. Sam didn't turn to look at the jar on the pedestal, but kept his eyes fixed on the wall, where the archway would eventually reappear. In truth, he didn't know. At the moment, the spook was seemingly trapped in a jar, and couldn't do anything. If, and that was a big if in his mind, the spook wasn't actually a spook, he would only be able to find out if he opened the jar, and so risk being haunted. If you don't try haunting me when I open the jar, he said, that would prove to me you're not a spook. Does this mean you will let me out? The shadows asked, hopefully. Because I can't haunt you. Even if I could, I wouldn't. I didn't say that, Sam replied. There was silence, as Sam had nothing more to say, and the spook was clearly trying to figure out what else to say to convince him to free it. Well, said the shadows, if you won't free me, could you please take me with you? You don't have to open this jar. I won't even try escaping. I promise. Please, I just want to see my mum and dad again. Please take me with you. I won't even speak if you don't want me to. Please. Sam was about to laugh at this suggestion, but as he thought about it, he decided it might not be a bad idea. If the shadows were a spook, then the jar was clearly able to keep it contained. Otherwise, it would have charged at him. So touching the jar shouldn't be dangerous, he reasoned. And Sam had a clear reason to take the jar, although he didn't want to admit it. The sense of loneliness he felt in this place was wearing him down, and having a companion, however evil, would make him feel less lonely. He was about to turn around and ask another question before finally making up his mind when something moved out of the corner of his eye. He looked towards the movement and saw that in the top right corner of the room, next to the ceiling, the stones were moving aside to form a dark entrance. A large one. Sam watched with interest, which quickly turned into horror as he saw crawling out of it a giant spider. He shouted in terror and swung his head around looking for an exit, but still no archway had appeared or reappeared. He was trapped. The spider, still standing on the wall, turned its head and looked at him with its red eyes. Sam stepped back as the creature began creeping its way down the wall towards the floor. "Oh, Worldmaker, help me!" he managed to pray as he stumbled backwards into the pedestal. "Free me!" the shadows yelled. He glanced at the jar now wobbling on the pedestal from where he had brushed against it. "I can help," the shadows said, as the spider crawled towards them in a patient manner, its fangs clicking and snapping together. Sam grabbed the jar and tried unscrewing the lid, his dread of spooks suddenly gone, and replaced with the fear of death by giant spider. The spider was getting closer and closer, not wasting any energy as it moved in on its prey. As hard as Sam tried, he could not get the metal lid off the jar. His hands were too sweaty. He kept retreating backwards, his eyes always on the huge spider, and then, in desperation and panic, he lifted the jar above his head and threw it as hard as he could onto the floor in front of him. He never saw the jar shatter, because as soon as it made contact with the floor, the shadows flew up into the air past his face and towards the pedestal. From there, they flowed into the clothes on the ground. The clothes then began to rise about half a foot off the ground and rearranged themselves into a human-like form. The dress with sleeves rose off the ground first, and then the shoulder cape came down on top of it, the hood lifted up. The mittens, however, didn't attach themselves to the sleeves of the dress, but floated about half an inch away from the ends of the sleeves. From behind, and at a distance, it would be easy to mistake the floating clothes for a girl dressed up for cold weather, but for the fact that the dress was floating less than half a foot from the ground, and the shadowy vaporous tendrils which were visible underneath the petticoat skirt. The spider had stopped moving when it saw the jar shatter on the floor, and was now eyeing the floating clothes and was preparing to leap at them. Then a sleeve with a mitten hovering at the end rose, pointing at the spider. What happened next, Sam almost had difficulty believing. A flash of lightning flew out of the mitten and struck the spider in the face, causing the arachnid to fall on its back. The creature was still alive, shrieking in pain and rolling across the floor, its legs flailing everywhere. Sam knew intuitively that it would be back on its feet shortly, and he had to get out of there fast. As he thought this, he heard the sound of stones moving behind him. He turned and saw an archway forming in what was once a solid stone wall. "Come on!" he yelled, running through the archway. The spook, although Sam was now certain it wasn't a spook, turned to look at him. The hood was filled with a pure darkness, except for the two bright white orbs which had to be its eyes. It blinked, and then floated towards him, and followed him through the archway. They ran down the passageway. Although Sam knew they were safe, because the archway was too small for a spider that big to fit through, he didn't stop running until he had turned around a corner. "I think we're safe now," he said, halting at a dead end. He turned to look at the shadowy form, now inhabiting the clothes, which was looking at him. The face was unreadable, of course. Then Sam could have sworn he saw the orbs grow bigger and brighter before the form flew towards him at speed. Sam thought for a second that he had made a terrible mistake, and he was about to be haunted or possessed. But a moment later, he realized that the shadowy thing was hugging him. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you so much." Sam didn't know what to do. He'd never received a hug from anyone like this. Awkwardly, he decided it would only be polite to hug back. It was very strange. It was like hugging a soft, flexible balloon. He felt that if he hugged the dress too hard, he'd squeeze the shadow out of the clothes. Meanwhile, the shadowy creature kept thanking him. Thank you, she kept saying. "Enough of that," said Sam, his face growing red. He pushed her off him, and was surprised to find that despite the fact she was floating, He was about half a head taller than her. "I've got to ask," he said. "What's your name, and what are you?"